Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. In the investigation that's taking place of Donald Trump and his cabinet ministers, or former cabinet ministers and former advisors, and their relationship with Russia, there's an underlying basic assumption, and this is a word that's used over and over again, which is Russia is America's adversary. In an op-ed, John McCain recently says that Russia is a threat to European democracy, to American democracy, and Putin is being described in many ways as an authoritarian, a fascist, and so on. The underlying issue of the Russian alleged hacking, interference in American elections, there is this underlying assumption that Russia is, in fact, this almost existential enemy. And some argue, well, it is an existential enemy because it's the only country with a nuclear weapons force that could actually cause serious damage to the United States. All of that brings back all the notions and feelings and imagery of the Cold War. Well, on the left, there's also a debate about all of this. There are people on the left that think that the Russia interference, true or untrue, is a distraction from much bigger issues about the Trump administration. And there's others that believe that while maybe it's being used as a distraction, it doesn't mean it isn't a real issue, that Putin actually represents such a threat, certainly domestically and otherwise. So we've been covering this issue on The Real News, and we thought what we really needed to do next was a debate with two people who probably agree on all sorts of things when it comes to a critique of U.S. foreign policy, but don't agree on the issue of how to assess Russia and the U.S.-Russia relationship. Now, there's a news story that is breaking, sort of breaking. BBC reports the following. NATO defense ministers are reviewing progress in what's known as the alliance's enhanced forward presence, its deployment of troops eastwards to reassure worried allies and deter any Russian move west. NATO has dispatched 4 battalion-sized battle groups, one deployed in Poland, one in each of the 3 Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The U.S. has also begun to bring back heavy armored units to Western Europe. Now, it's also been reported by AP that President Trump will meet President Putin at the G20 next week. So this feels very much like the old days of the Cold War. Now joining us to talk and perhaps debate all of this, first of all, joining us from Connecticut, Farmington, Connecticut, is Bill Curry. Bill's a columnist for Salon.com and the Daily Beast, and he was White House counselor to President Bill Clinton. And joining us from Moscow is Jeffrey Taylor. Jeffrey is a contributing editor at The Atlantic and the author of 7 books. He has lived in Moscow since 1993, and he recently outlined his proposal for a new détente between the U.S. and Russia called The Deal Trump Should Strike with Putin. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So Bill, why don't you start this off and make the basic argument that you think this Russia-Putin, it should be taken seriously?
I'll take a stab at it, Paul. One of the problems with making this argument is that it's so easily confused with other arguments that aren't as good. And one of them is the argument made today in USA Today by Senator McCain that this is a national security in the conventional sense threat to the United States. That is a kind of continuation of the historic roles the two countries played vis-a-vis one another. It's a different kind of threat, and it's not. Just make a couple of points. One, it's not Russia. To me, it's Putin. It's not about the use of military force against Europe. It is about corruption, however. Cyber warfare is one of the many ways in which it's gotten easier for people to go to war. In the United States, the Congress doesn't do anything. We don't have to pay the taxes. Now we send drones. It's just made it all too easy to slip into wars that are never good for anyone. And cyber warfare sort of falls into that category. And the second piece of it is what he's using the cyber warfare for, and that is the corruption of what is already a precarious institution, and that is our democracy, both here and really throughout the world. And so Putin's hostility to democracy, his almost scornful contempt for it, the way he governs at home, the alliances he makes, and his subversive activities in other democracies are what make him a threat today. It is this behavior itself which comprises the threat. And I believe it is a real threat. And I believe the fact that the United States, to its eternal detriment, has been doing similar things in other countries all over the world, certainly since the late 19th century, doesn't make this less of a problem now. I wish there were some Democrat in Congress who would stand up and say, this is the time for us to evaluate what we do. And for Americans, if Americans only knew that we brought down a democratically elected prime minister in Iran in 1953, causing the enmity that has lasted 3 generations, that what we did to precipitate the conflict in Vietnam that bled us dry, the lies we told to get into Iraq, and how much harm we did ourselves in the world. This pattern of American involvement, both overt and military and covert, in determining the destinies of other countries, needs to be brought to an end. But that doesn't mean that Putin doesn't need to be called for what he is, which is at the very least a proto-fascist, and that his continued contempt for and corruption of democracy across the world doesn't pose a threat. Okay, Jeffrey.
Well, I think we have to look, first of all, at the world that Putin came into when he took over in 2000. The post-Cold War architecture of the world was built by the United States. During the 90s, Russia was a vassal state, basically, of the United States, an ally of the United States, if an unruly one, an extremely corrupt and violent one. During the Yeltsin years, there were murders of journalists and politicians as well. But when Putin took over as president, he made overtures to the West. He talked about joining NATO. He talked about building a common security alliance from Vladivostok to Paris, or whatever the phrasing was at the time. That is, that would include the West, or that Russia would be included in the security structure. And after 9/11, he was the first the first leader to offer his unconditional support to the Bush presidency. He came on television a few hours after the attack. Now, he was spurned in these and was became especially displeased with the way the United States was treating Russia when Russia refused to play along with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think we have to go back to that and see how we have expanded NATO in violation of promises given orally to the Gorbachev administration by the George W.H. Bush administration, and as Germany was reuniting. The hostility that has created has permeated the relationship of Russian-American relations since the expansion began in the mid-90s. And George Kennan, the senior diplomat and architect of the containment policy, warned very clearly that if we expand NATO up to Russia's borders, which we've done, we'll kill democracy in Russia. We'll set off a new Cold War that will probably end in a hot war. Well, he says words seem to be being borne out by events. Now, the questions to me that I would put to Bill is, what is the end game here? What is the goal? Henry Kissinger once said, the test of a policy is not how it begins, but how it ends. What is the goal to be pursued by this relentless assault against Russia and the refusal to cooperate on issues in which Russia and the United States have common interests, most obviously terrorism, but also in case of last year or two, especially North Korea. We really do have more in common than we're led to believe, and this constant barrage that's aimed personally at Putin is not taken as being in Russia, at least, as criticism just of Putin, but because Russians are so overwhelmingly supportive of Putin, Russians take it personally. This started with Obama, most in particular, but with Hillary Clinton. Right. Likening Putin to Hitler.
Let's put that question to Bill then. Go ahead.
Let me first just reference one thing that Jeff just said, and that is I agree with almost everything he just said. I do think that the question of the Eastern European countries bordering the old Soviet Union, now Russia, is trickier than either side lets on. And I do believe that what the United States ought to exemplify, what every developed democracy ought to exemplify, is a commitment to self-determination. I'm for referenda on autonomy in Scotland. I'm for it, and Staten Island wants to leave New York. And I think that I have no doubt that if you had a referendum in the Crimea, they'd go with Russia. I think the same is true of Eastern Ukraine. I don't think it's true of Western Ukraine. And I don't think it's true of any of those other countries. And those countries all made decisions about their well-being based upon centuries of experience with Russia. And I don't think they were being just paranoid, you know. And the second thing I want to say is that we often talk about this as if the United States were supposed to be leading this policy. And in some ways it did when it shouldn't have. And I regret that, and the country should regret it. But this will be Europe's decision about how it views both the importance of those countries to its security and its willingness to invest in theirs. And that's just getting us to borrow a much maligned phrase from some anonymous staffer of Barack Obama. It's actually a place where we should be leading from behind, because it's not our backyard, it's theirs. Regarding the question of of where this policy goes, I think it can go in the right direction. A policy could move in the right direction if it makes the right distinctions. And the distinction here is about, number one, the global subversion of democracy. This is a tool that an economically disempowered Russia and a militarily cautious Russia has chosen to utilize now, and not even really to utilize, but really to brandish. It's not really clear how much of an effort Putin's made to cover any of this up.
Bill, what are some examples of what you're talking about?
The United States election, the election of Donald Trump. Without Comey, Hillary Clinton, I did everything I could to stop her from being nominated. I then did everything I could to get her elected, because I think that when you see fascism, you should kill it in its crib. And I put Trump in a category close to Putin on many counts. And I do believe that those interventions in this election made the difference. It's hard, having spent my lifetime in electoral politics, I'm always hard pressed to believe anyone could interpret it otherwise. Not that she should have done 100 things differently to secure the election to a degree that it couldn't be stolen from her. I believe the president of France and the complaints that he's made, they all seem plausible to me. I don't even, sometimes people will say that, borrowing from Shakespeare, that they protest too much. Putin doesn't even protest that much when these accusations are leveled at him. There's not even, there's not all that much of an attempt to even deny it. So I think in this case, while our intelligence agencies have often given us bum steers, the 17 who agreed it happened here and the intelligence services in France that said it happened there are correct. And at this point, Putin seems to show no appetite for reining this effort in. And I do believe that ought to be sanctioned. And I do believe, I want to go back to what I said before, that democracy is in such a precarious condition. You know, if Francis Fukuyama had it all wrong, this is nowhere near the end of history. And these arrangements are not even near to being solid and reliable going forward.
Okay, Bill, let's get Jeffrey in. So Putin as a threat to global democracy is the basic charge I'm hearing.
Well, it's pretty amazing to hear this repeated, not just by Bill, but by so many others. When the instances that most commonly are cited, France, for instance, Bill mentioned earlier, the chief of cybersecurity of France came out and denied that there was any evidence of Russian hacking after Macron had made the statement around the time of his campaign. And as far as the hacking scandal in the United States goes, well, I await an independent commission, because I just don't get there are so many allegations based on anonymous sources. We have 17 agencies, we're being told, concurred in this, when in fact it's really only 3 that the other agencies signed off on, and those with guarded assessments and not conclusions. But the point is that Russia is comparatively weak and would not be able to sway the voters in Europe or sway the voters in the United States. And the Macedonian fellows who orchestrated these fake news sites, I just have a hard time believing that they significantly impacted the race. But again, we come back to the question of where does this go? If Russia is made to feel an outsider to the international system, you can expect Russia to resist. Now, Bill mentioned that Putin hasn't overtly denied it. Well, the Kremlin denied it from the start, and the Russians take a different attitude. Their power structures don't communicate effusively with the public in the same way that they do in the West. I mean, Putin just, in a sense, he's not dignifying some of the allegations with a lot of attention. But they have come out repeatedly and said it was not true. And Putin recently told that to Megyn Kelly. So you can expect him to be somewhat disdainful if they didn't do it of the questions put to him, because he knows Russia didn't do it. Now, I say that we should have an independent commission to determine that. And the question still begs to be asked then, where do we go from here? In the situation we're in with Baltic states being in NATO, they have been now for more than a decade. We are approaching the military exercises in September on the Russian side. The tensions are very high. There's a risk of war again. There are repeated intercepts of both of Russian planes intercepting United States and the other way around. Just last week, a Russian military newspaper reported that they had intercepted 17 times NATO planes flying near the borders. These things can go wrong. They don't need to continue. The two sides need to get together and decide what.
Jeffrey, before we get to that question you're raising, and we will next, but deal first of all with Bill's sort of the core of Bill's accusation against Putin, which is all wrapped up in this term that he says he's some kind of a fascist. He uses the word, and that puts Putin in a different kind of character in terms of how people should think about this whole issue of Russian interference in elections and such.
Well, when I hear the word fascist, I don't just think of the official definition of the term. I think of Hitler and Mussolini and the mass extermination of the Jews in the Second World War. And obviously obviously Putin is nowhere near anything like that, nor is he anything like Stalin. I think we just have to get back to dealing with heads of state as heads of state and stop the name calling and understand that common interests should outweigh the personal feelings that we might have towards the Russians, or in the case of Russians, toward the United States. That's what Nixon and Kissinger did. That's what Reagan and James Baker did at the end of the Cold War. There was no love lost for Reagan with the Soviet Union, yet he managed to strike a deal with Gorbachev and end the Cold War peacefully. That's what needs to happen again.
Bill, you continue to use that word.
First of all, I agree with that, but go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry.
I was saying you continue to use that word, which is, I mean, you know, is a rat. I mean, I guess it's meant to be, but it is an inflammatory word. What do you make of what Jeffrey's saying, that this is not an appropriate kind of language to use about Putin?
Let me just say, first of all, I think the single individual world leader I hear use it the most is Putin. And he uses it for reasons of his own. But let me tell you why I use it. I've used it with reference to Trump and as well, by the way. And I realize that it's important that everyone understand that the word fascist doesn't mean Nazi. And in a way, it's too bad that Hitler robbed us of the word fascist by so commingling it with such horrible evil. But what fascist does mean is hyper-nationalism. It means the use of violence to suppress your opponents. It means the shutting down of all political dissent of the marketplace of ideas. It means identifying vulnerable minorities and scapegoating them as unpatriotic conspirators. It means usually the merger of corporate and state interests. It means hypermilitarism. Putin checks every single box. And it's like, well, you know, I've had this discussion about Trump. People say, well, how can you call him a fascist? And yet the New York Times calls him a populist. That's not nearly as close as fascist, nor is liberal or conservative or Republican. All political labels are best used with conscious imprecision. But the point in every debate is to get to the one that comes closest to illuminating rather than clouding the issue. I do believe you can pick a better word if you think you have one, and I'm open to it. But a corruptive, authoritarianism is a disease, just as corruption itself is a disease pandemic on this planet right now. We're in a global pandemic of corruption, which is at the center of the political debate in countries all over the world right now, not in ours. And that Putin is one of the people who is really an avatar of the problem and a promoter of it at the same time. That's what I want to isolate and to look at. I take Putin not quite in the way that Jeffrey does. You know, when he says he's not in the eastern Ukraine, he's lying, and all the evidence we have says that he's lying about his interference in these elections. But let me just say that I try here not to jump ahead of it. The stage we're at here is probable cause, not conviction. Okay, and I agree. I want the commission. I want congressional and independent commissions. I'm hoping that the FBI and the Justice Department will do their jobs. I'm hoping that we can root this out. But in the meantime, the problem with all public corruption cases is that it takes so long to settle them. You know, George Bush can say he can't say a thing about Scooter Libby because there's a trial going on, but the investigation will go on for years.
Okay,
we have to make decisions right now about where we stand. And the evidence to me that Jeff seems to me to slight a little bit, the evidence to me seems overwhelming.
Okay, let's just set aside the election thing for a minute because I want to focus on this issue. Jeffrey, with Bill's definition of what a modern fascist is, and that Putin checks all the boxes, and he says Trump does too, but we're talking about Putin right now. Do you disagree with that?
Well, listen, Putin is the embodiment of a Russian tradition that extends back centuries, an authoritarian ruler who controls both, in a certain way, business and the government. And this has been a tradition in Russia. It was obviously the case in the Soviet Union, where the state controlled the economy. And it was to a great extent in Tsarist Russia, where senior figures in the business community were basically allowed to be so by the Tsar. They were granted. Anyway, the point is that Russians will never be as Americans are. There's no liberal Western democratic-style politician waiting in the wings, waiting to take over from Putin if he were to die or be overthrown. In fact, you would get the opposite. So this problem is not going to go away when Putin goes away. And he's immortal, so that could happen. Now, we have to understand that this means Russia has a unique system amongst the major European powers, to put it that way, but it's also an Asian power. We just have to deal with the Russians as they are, agree to disagree on certain things, and move away from psychoanalysts or any other kind of analysts that becomes intrusive into the discourse to the point where we can't have a normal discourse between two countries that have massive nuclear arsenals and that can destroy the world. We have to put aside the definitions and start talking about what we can do to ratchet down this conflict before we wake up one morning and discover that there's been a collision and that the nuclear missiles are being launched. That is a reasonable fear to have these days. It has been reasonable, especially since the last 3 years with the Ukraine crisis breaking out. But earlier this year, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock 50 seconds closer to midnight. We are in as dangerous a situation as we were in the early 1950s at the height of the Cold War, when we had no dialogue with Russia, with the Soviet Union. We're basically in the same situation today, although the sides communicate in ways they didn't back then. We've got to stop this.
Okay. Bill, I'm going to give you the last word, but this is obviously just the beginning of a much bigger, broader debate.
I agree with so much that Jeffrey has said, and I wish we could sort of pierce through some of the polarities of this. And one thing I would just like to point out is that I by the way, think that among the many instances of our self-destructive intercessions in economies and democracies of other countries is Russia. And the United States went into Russia in the 1990s and during that transition and told everybody to deregulate everything immediately, privatize everything immediately, and go for complete austerity. They didn't realize what a free market really was. We sent ideologues over there to do things that we've actually never done or only came to do some of later. And I don't quite read the history in the same way that Jeffrey does. I think there was a moment where democracy was very popular in Russia and Vietnam. There are lots of places in the world where we squandered the reputation of democracy through our, ideologues abroad programs of both Democratic and Republican administrations. And so I think the United States, almost as much as Russia, created Putin by its ham-handed intercessions in Russia. And I don't think that Russia is a hostage to the history that Jeffrey describes. I don't think any country is. And I do agree, as the former political director of the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s, I do worry very much about what he said. And I actually think that that Donald Trump is more likely to stumble into a nuclear war than Vladimir Putin is to cause one on purpose. And I don't want to see these issues transmuted into the old national security doctrines that have done so little to make us safe. I think that we need to do what we can to support democracy through the force of law, not export it by the force of arms or in any other way. And I lastly just want to say I agree very much that getting all these other issues back on the table in a different environment is exactly what both countries need to do right now, and I pray they will do. But it doesn't mean that this issue of the corruption of democracy ought to be ignored. Okay.
We're going to end this for now, but I hope both of you come back and we can continue this. Clearly, we're just kind of scratching the surface here. We're also going to post an interview I did with Jeffrey a few weeks ago, which more or less the title of his article was also the title of our piece, which is the deal Trump should strike with Putin. And as I mentioned, Trump is going to be meeting with Putin at the G20. And we'll carry this on because I think we do want to turn the corner into what a more constructive engagement might look like. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.